An orphan was thrown out of her wealthy stepfather's funeral, depriving her of her share of the inheritance. But when the notary gathered the entire family and read the will, breathless Ronaldo Borio returned home. The double stroller, which barely squeezed through the doorway, dangerously tilted, about to topple over along with the children. Ronaldo managed to catch it in time. Muddy tracks left by the autumn rain stained the floor. But Ronaldo would never leave the stroller in the common hallway. He had already had his bicycle stolen once and wasn't willing to take any more risks, especially not with something as important, and more importantly, as expensive as the stroller. It wasn't something he got for his good looks. He suspected one of his neighbors of the theft, a grumpy, nagging old man who seemed displeased with the clutter on the landing. But Ronaldo had no proof. He accepted his defeat, and from then on, kept all his belongings inside the apartment, away from prying eyes. He carefully lifted the children out of the stroller, one by one. First his younger daughter, Ramona, then his older son, Lolo. Although the children were twins, titles like younger and older were arbitrary. After all, was it really significant that Ramona was born 8 minutes after Lolo? In the future, few would care. At least that's what Ronaldo thought. For now, they were only 3 years old, but calling them this way was convenient for him, not just for him, but also for his wife. Ronaldo undressed the children one by one. First, he took off the snowsuit from the younger one. She always got terribly fussy when she was too warm. Then he undressed the older one. He wasn't thrilled about being bundled up like a butterfly ready to emerge from its cocoon, but he soon. After all, he wasn't just older, he was also a man, or rather a future man. Ronaldo's wife, Teresa, believed that girls could be forgiven for things that boys could not, so they always attended to Lolo only after finishing with his younger sister. Would this affect him in the future? Quite possibly, just as it was possible that Ramona would be affected by the permissiveness, but the consequences of such parenting were still a long way off. For now, the main thing was to keep afloat. Ronaldo dressed the children, washed them, and sat them in their high chairs. He had already finished his morning shift at the factory. Ronaldo was a man of intellectual disposition, but money still needed to be earned somehow. After his shift, he picked the kids up from daycare and then took them for a walk until it was time for dinner. In just 30 minutes, he had to head off to his second job. Ronaldo wasn't just a simple worker. He also worked at a bank, taking on evening shifts as a financial consultant. He needed to leave in 30 minutes, and Ronaldo still hadn't started feeding the children. Usually, Teresa took care of the kids in the evening, well, not the whole evening. The young mother didn't seem to enjoy her relatively new role very much. As soon as the opportunity arose, she would immediately pass the children off to her husband, and she didn't care at all that her spouse was incredibly tired from working 2 jobs. Now it was her turn to take care of the kids, but she had disappeared somewhere. Ronaldo heated up the food and clapped his hands irritably. "And where is your mom?" he asked the preschoolers. "Do you know where she is?" In response, he received only confused looks. Lolo blinked his eyes while Ramona unexpectedly smacked her hand on the table, probably imitating her father. Ronaldo pressed his lips together and smiled at the children for a split second. That was enough to start berating himself. After all, he had just blamed the children for Teresa giving birth to them. The truth was, they had rushed into having kids. Teresa herself didn't really want to work, nor did she want to take care of the children. Ronaldo simply couldn't split himself in two. He might have wanted to, but it was physically impossible. Every time he regretted that Teresa had given birth to these wonderful children, he spent the next week in a state of blue. How could he even think that? How did such a thought even enter his mind? In the end, he would calm down, deciding that it was all just stress from overwork. Oh, if only Teresa spent even just 1 more hour with the children than she usually did. Rado approached the little ones and kissed both of them on their tiny heads. Of course, the first kiss went to Ramona since she was the younger one, and the next, logically the last, was for Manolo. It was good that, at this age, they hadn't yet realized that some of them were getting a bit more attention. Perhaps one day they would understand. After kissing the children, Rado dashed out of the kitchen, wanting to take a better look around their small apartment. Maybe his wife had just fallen asleep and hadn't heard them come in. Or maybe she was hiding somewhere, not wanting to deal with her own children. If so, Rado would have to make her take care of them. Why did Teresa always shirk her responsibilities? After all, she was the one who wanted to have a baby. She insisted that it was time for them to grow up, time to become parents. So why then wasn't she taking care of the children at all? This was something Rado didn't understand, but he had no time to dwell on these thoughts. He would have loved, like Teresa, to collapse on the couch in front of the TV, or, as his beloved often did, sit on the balcony with a cigarette, contemplating life. But he didn't have time for such luxuries. Rado continued to search for his wife, but his hopes were not fulfilled. Besides Rado, his children, and a lonely half-rotted cactus, there was no one else in the apartment. Teresa had disappeared again. Well, this wasn't the first time. He returned to the kitchen, quickly fed the children, all the while nervously glancing at the clock. "I can't be late for work," he muttered. He pulled them out of their high chairs and sat them down in front of a pile of scattered toys. When only a few minutes were left before he had to leave for work, the front door slowly opened. Rado jumped with joy. He mentally thanked himself, his wife, and even offered a brief thank you to God that she had come back. But he didn't yet know what lay ahead. He kissed the children again, in the same order, but this time with more enthusiasm, and ran to greet his wife. "Teresa, have you seen the time? I could be late for work. Where have you been?" he began, nervously throwing on his coat. As he carelessly wrapped his scarf, he continued, "I fed the kids so you don't need to do anything. Just watch them, play with them, you'll figure it out. Teresa, why are you so quiet?" Teresa, who had just returned from who knows where, stood motionless in the hallway. She hadn't even taken off her coat. Her expression was tired, although obviously she didn't have much to be tired from. Their day went something like this. Rado got up early in the morning, took the kids to daycare, and then rushed to work. After work, he picked up the kids, took them home, fed them, and then dashed off to his second job. What did Teresa do during this time? Who knows? Watch TV, chat on the phone. Maybe she went for walks, enjoying the pond near their home. Maybe she had breakfast in a cafe. Her only responsibility was to watch the kids while Rado was at his second job. So what was she tired from? Strange. She was standing motionless in the hallway, her gaze wandering and mud was dripping from her boots. "Teresa, why are you just standing there?" Rado asked irritably, stopping at the apartment door. He thought he detected a new, very strange smell, something that reminded him of men's cologne. He sniffed the air but soon dismissed the odd and persistent thoughts. He asked again, "What's wrong with you?" Finally, Teresa snapped out of her trance. Her thin lips, painted with red lipstick, curled into a pout. "I'm sick of all this," she suddenly exhaled sharply and shouted. "I'm fed up with you and your kids too." Rado froze in place. Fed up? The kids? What was she talking about? He wanted to talk to Teresa, to approach her, to ask what had happened and what was bothering her. He wanted to, but there was no time. He replied, "Teresa, I understand. Sometimes you're in a bad mood. You know, I get that more often than I'd like. But can we not do this right now, okay? I need to get to work." A look of contempt appeared on the young woman's face. "If you were a real man, we'd be living a normal life." Rado glanced at the clock once more. He should have left 2 minutes ago, but he could stay another minute. "A real man," he repeated. "What are you implying? Are you saying I'm not doing enough for our family?" "Real men earn real money," she replied carelessly. "And what about you? You don't even have a proper job and we have no money. Do you enjoy living like this? We're practically poor." Rado clenched his jaw tightly. Did he enjoy living like this? Of course not. He hated working at the factory. He hated when Ramona looked longingly at a toy he couldn't afford to buy. He hated when he almost went without dinner, giving everything to his wife and kids. He hated having to listen to his unemployed wife's tantrums while running late for work. Maybe on another day, in another mood, or under different circumstances, he wouldn't have said anything. But right now, Rado was on edge. "If you, my dear, were capable of looking after your own children, I could have gotten a good job. But you're too delicate for that, aren't you? Maybe you've forgotten that you were the one who wanted these kids." Thea's gaze became cold and hostile. Rado felt as if she had turned to ice. He even sensed the chill spreading through the apartment. She replied to him as if she were speaking to someone she despised with all her heart. "I didn't know it would be this hard with them. I'm fed up with them. I don't love them." Now it seemed that Rado had turned to ice himself. His wife's words stirred a storm of emotions within him. Not love them, her own children? It seemed like she needed to get her head checked. How could anyone not love their own children? She's a mother, after all. How is that even possible? Yes, Rado had been angry at the children before. There were times when he raised his voice at them, times like today, when for a split second he regretted starting a family. But those thoughts were fleeting, as if they were unnatural, unnecessary, like a sugar substitute. It's sweet, but it's not sugar. Such thoughts would come and go, not really his own but foreign. But hearing such words from his wife, the mother of his children, was truly terrifying. And maybe, if Rado hadn't been on edge that day, maybe if he had stayed to talk with her, life would have turned out differently. But Rado did what he did. He approached his wife, grabbed her by the shoulders, and shaking her slightly, said, "I'm late for work. Take off your coat, wash your hands, and go take care of your son and daughter." Having said these words, he immediately rushed out of the apartment. From that moment on, Rado never saw Teresa again ever. Teresa left. She left their lives forever without leaving a trace. While Rado was at work, as could be guessed, she didn't take care of the children. As if she had prepared in advance, she packed all her things and left the apartment. She left without thinking that the 4-year-old twins were left in the apartment with only a half-rotted cactus for company, in other words, completely alone. When Rado returned home, he found a horrifying scene. Little Ramona was sitting on the windowsill, and by the grace of God, she hadn't fallen out of the window, while Manolo was playing near an electrical outlet, trying to find objects that would fit into its holes. The apartment was empty, as if Teresa had never been there. Rado might have thought that was the case, that all the years they spent together were just a mirage. But then, where did the children come from? After gathering himself a bit, he began to question the little ones. "Where's Mom? Where did your mom go?" His voice sounded as if he was on the verge of hysteria. Manolo, sitting on the floor, made a noise that was somewhere between a hiccup and a little song. Ramona, although 8 minutes younger, behaved much more maturely. She stood up, put her hands on her hips, and answered. Mom left, lowering her voice. She added with a certain cruelty, "Hope she doesn't come back." She turned to her brother. "Right, Manolo." Manolo responded with the same indistinct sound. Hearing Ramona, Rado realized everything. In fact, he had known all along that this would happen sooner or later. After all, Teresa was someone far removed from motherhood. The harsh words she had spoken during their last encounter, the way she spoke with such hatred about not loving their children, were terrifying. Rado understood that his wife had left him for good. A little later, he would find a note from her. It would say something like, "I can't live like this anymore. I'm leaving you for someone else. My new man is better than you," and so on. It was painful for Rado to read. It was painful to realize that his wife had left him. But this pain was dulled by another, more terrifying feeling. The realization that his wife, now apparently his ex-wife, had so easily abandoned their children. Leaving was one thing, but to leave them alone, it meant she truly hated them. Who in their right mind could leave 4-year-old children completely alone? Only a true psychopath, no less, or rather, a psychopathic woman. Maybe Rado would have taken some time to reflect, to spend a little time alone. Perhaps he would have sought solace in a bottle of alcohol, but he didn't have the time for that. He had to work, find a nanny for the evening, and take care of the children. As for suffering, perhaps that could wait until later, some other time, if ever. Rado began to spin like a hamster in a wheel, but unlike a hamster, he acted with purpose. He calculated everything, planned everything. Each of his actions had meaning. It was hard for him, so incredibly hard, but he managed to bear the burden that had fallen on him. In fact, at some point, he realized that it was even a little easier without his wife. Yes, he had to pay an outsider to take care of the children, but at least he no longer had to listen to endless complaints. Besides, the nanny's salary was significantly less than the money that used to go toward his wife's whims. In short, he was now raising 2 small children on his own. At first, it was difficult, but children grow up quickly. When they started school, Rado realized it was time for a change. After all, there was some truth to his wife's words. He had indeed been stuck in place. He didn't want to spend his whole life living in poverty, as Teresa had put it. He didn't want to live on the edge of starvation in the future. As soon as Ramona and Manolo started school, Rado knew it was time. Rado had always been interested in finance. He was a smart man with a good sense for the business world. He had always wanted more, and he knew that his time would come. He knew that his day of success would arrive, and so it did. After years of poverty, sleepless nights, and countless unsuccessful attempts, he finally managed to start his own business. He tried many things. He opened a small neighborhood store, ran a little pub, and sold children's goods. But his true success lay in the field he knew best, finance. When his children turned 14, Rado opened his first successful venture, his own bank. Yes, his bank wasn't the leading one in the country, and it didn't even rank him at the top, but it was his passion. Those who said he was just a child of rich parents, that he had simply been lucky and caught a break, didn't know how difficult the journey had been for him. They didn't know what Rado had gone through. They didn't know how he had gone without food, using the last of the groceries to prepare dinner for his children. No one knew what Rado had endured during his long life. From that point on, he was known only as the wealthy owner of the large company. Rado Borio, he was known as the richest man in their chestins. One wonders what Teresa would say if she knew what her ex-husband had achieved, but Rado had made up his mind he would never forgive her. Time passed, and the children grew older. Rado could see that they were turning into typical members of the golden youth, disinterested in anything meaningful, living a wild lifestyle. He saw it all clearly, but there was nothing he could do about it. After all, a childhood spent in poverty had its consequences. It also didn't help that Ramona, in a way, was always loved more. She grew up to be a selfish, self-centered, and even cruel young woman. Sometimes Rado would have serious conversations with her, threatening to cut off her money, but it didn't help. Perhaps she had already formed as a person, or maybe it was all in the genes from her weak mother. Who knows why she turned out this way? But the fact remained, she couldn't be changed. Manolo, on the other hand, behaved exactly the same as his older sister. The only difference was that, while Ramona acted this way because it was who she was, her brother Manolo simply did whatever his sister told him to do. Perhaps if he had been alone, or if he hadn't been so restricted during his childhood, he might have grown into a completely different person. But like Ramona, he had already grown up. No matter how much Rado wished to change his children, there was nothing he could do. The business flourished, expanding with new bank branches opening across the country. The children were still under 18 when Rado fell in love again, for the second time in his long life. Finally, he met the one he had been searching for all his life, his second wife, a kind and warm-hearted woman named Beatrice Apova. She had once worked for Rado as a financial consultant. Rado knew he was in love from the moment he first saw her. In fact, he couldn't understand how anyone could not love a woman like her. He pondered this question for good reason. Like Rado, Beatrice had a child from her first marriage. On their first date, she shared her life story with her future husband. She told him how her first husband had left her with a baby in her arms. Rado couldn't understand that either. He couldn't fathom how someone could abandon their child, how someone could leave such a lovely, sweet woman alone. He proposed to Bea after just a month of dating. After their wedding, Beatrice and her daughter Adelia, who was 5 years younger than Ramona and Manolo, moved into Rado's home. Rado and Bea didn't introduce their children to each other right away. Although Rado never admitted it, he was very nervous. He feared that Beatrice might leave him if she saw the little devils he had raised. But they couldn't delay it any longer. Immediately after the wedding, as Beatrice and Adelia were moving into their new home, the children had to be introduced. Manolo and Ramona made faces. By then, they were both 17. Rado stood opposite his now grown-up children. Ramona was so beautiful. Manolo was a tall and handsome young man. How unfortunate that their appearance didn't match their inner qualities. Rado cleared his throat and adopted a serious expression as he began to speak to his children. Ramona, Manolo, he began, you know that I got married today. It's a shame that you didn't bother to come to your own father's wedding. If you had, you would know that my wife has a daughter. Ramona rolled her eyes, and Manolo didn't know what to think. He glanced at his sister with a worried look, which appeared quite comical. A tall, strong guy literally looking up to his petite, delicate sister. Ramona nodded to him and replied, Dad, don't nag. We went to Carla Alcaraz's party. She's my former classmate. There was a party. What would you choose? Go to a cool bash with friends or sit among old folks and your dad's boring friends? Rado sighed heavily. Manolo, what do you have to say for yourself? You're the older brother. You should have your own opinion. Did you just follow your sister's lead again? Did you really enjoy that party? He spat out the last word with undisguised contempt. How could the daughter of such an influential man talk in such terrible slang? Rado couldn't understand this either. He stared intently at his son, expecting a reasonable answer. Manolo hesitated. Ramona said, well, I wanted to go to the party too, not your wedding. And why did you even get married? He glanced at his sister again, and as soon as she smiled back, he straightened his shoulders proudly. Dad, what did you expect from us? We've got our own stuff going on. Rado shook his head, trying to find some positive aspect in his children's behavior, and to his surprise, found one. At least they were inseparable, always together. Indeed, there was some special bond between the twins. Oddly enough, their mother never had such a special connection with them. Sighing again, he continued, so since you missed my wedding, you missed a lot. My wife, Bea, will be living with us, which should be obvious, but her daughter, Adelia, will also be moving in. I'm going to bring them in now so you can meet them. He gave his children a warning look. And you better not mistreat Adelia, or else. He considered what mattered most to them, and then added, I'll cut off your money completely, not just for a while, but forever. Got it? Manolo nodded, while Ramona replied with a smirk, you picked a woman with baggage, Dad. With our money, you could have married a model. Ramona calmed down. Her father replied evenly, I'm going to get them now. Rado went to fetch his new family, who were waiting for him in the car outside the house. He brought them into the living room, where his children from his first marriage sat sullenly waiting. He quickly introduced them to his wife. Bea, Ramona, and Manolo forced smiles. But even that pleased Rado. He knew it was the most he could expect from them. Then it was time to introduce Adelia. The 12-year-old schoolgirl stood shyly next to her mother. Truthfully, she didn't want to move in at all. She hadn't gotten used to this man, supposedly her new father. And now she had to deal with a new brother and sister too. They were so alike, so close. Adelia hoped they would accept her into their unique little group. Eventually, her mother spoke up. Ramona, you're so beautiful, she said with a smile. Manolo, you're so manly, a real man. I hope you and my Adelia get along quickly. Ramona continued to smile, but it was a forced smile. To someone who didn't know her, it might have seemed genuine, but her father knew better. He understood that his beautiful daughter could be quite cruel. At that moment, his new wife tugged at his hand and before leaving, said to the children, well, get to know each other. Have fun, you're one family now. Rado couldn't help but follow his wife. The newlyweds laughed cheerfully, but Rado's last words were spoken with a strict tone. Ramona, Manolo, remember what I told you. With that, he left the room arm in arm with his smiling wife. Adelia shrank back in fear, while Ramona's lips curled into a cunning smirk. Manolo scratched his head awkwardly. Welcome, he said. The servants will show you to your room. Ramona shot her brother such a fierce and disapproving look that he now seemed more intimidated than a new little sister. A room for her. Why, Mona walked over to Adelia, leaning in close to her face. Do you think I don't know what you and your mom are up to trying to squeeze money out of our dad? This is all ours, she threw her arms out, gesturing at everything around them. This house, Dad's money, his company, you have no right to any of it, and if you try anything. At that moment, Manolo finally found his voice. Ramona, why are you treating her like that? Leave her alone, she's just a kid, Ramona responded by slapping her brother's hand, not hard, but enough to humiliate him. Are you stupid, Manolo? Why do we need this little brat? Why don't you get that when Dad kicks the bucket she's going to get in our way? She's small now, but she won't stay that way forever. As the brother and sister argued, Adelia felt like she was about to faint. What were they talking about? What money? What company? She didn't fully understand, but she knew one thing for sure, her mom wasn't like that. She would never forget the time when she and her mother had no money and bought just a loaf of bread and a stick of sausage with their last few coins. On the way home, they met a homeless man, and Adelia would always remember the pain in her mother's eyes as she gave him part of their meager purchase. Adelia's mother might not have been a genius, but she had a pure, kind heart. She knew how much her mom loved Rado, and hearing his daughter say such awful things was unbearable. Adelia decided to stand up both for her mom's honor and her own. My mom loves your dad. I know that very well. And I don't even want a room. I didn't want to move here at all, Ramona snapped. Shut up then, she turned to her brother. You're right about one thing, she's a little kid and dumb as a rock for now. But when she grows up, she might realize how lucky she is. Do you understand what that means? Ramona, enough, her older brother replied sharply. Dad's got a long life ahead of him, Ramona lowered her voice, speaking through gritted teeth. Did you forget what we discussed recently? Manolo raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, stepping back, as if to signal that he was done with this conversation. Ramona then turned back to her new sister, her face now adorned with a broad smile, though this smile was far more terrifying than anything she'd said earlier. Remember, you're nobody here, Adelia nervously swallowed and nodded. The last thing she wanted was to argue with these awful people. Satisfied with herself, Ramona continued, and don't say a word to your mom, got it? And especially not to our father. When they ask, you're going to cheerfully tell them that we've become friends. Adelia was trembling, but she felt she had to end the conversation on a positive note. She hoped that if she agreed, Ramona might soften a little. After all, she hadn't given up hope that they could one day become real friends. She replied, Okay, I won't tell anyone, I promise. And I'll say that we're friends now. Yeah, sure, Ramona said with a dismissive nod before turning away. Linking arms with her brother, she pulled him along as they disappeared to some unknown place. Adelia was left alone. This was definitely not how she had imagined meeting her new relatives. What was she supposed to do now? How could she earn their approval? Adelia realized that her new life would be luxurious but far from easy. Rado was so preoccupied with his wife that he didn't notice one seemingly insignificant yet important detail. With each passing day, Ramona was becoming more and more aggressive. Perhaps, at her age, she was beginning to take after her biological mother, or maybe it was because she had been spoiled as a child. In any case, Ramona was changing rapidly, and as she changed, so did Manolo. Meanwhile, Adelia, who was growing up under the same roof, remained as she had always been, kind, sweet, and open to the world. She certainly took after her own mother. Bea was living a happy life as the beloved wife of a successful businessman, and Rado's life hadn't changed much except for one thing. Now every morning began with a genuine happy smile. He had finally found the woman he had always dreamed of. The children were growing up. Manolo and Ramona had long since celebrated their coming of age, but they had no plans to move out of their father's house. They were more than content with a life where they never had to do or undertake anything. Rado had come to terms with what he had raised. Yes, they were unambitious and lazy, but they were his children, his flesh and blood, whom he loved despite everything. Even though their mother had turned out to be a true piece of work, he accepted that Ramona and Manolo were wasting their lives, hoping that maybe they would come to their senses later. Life could have been perfect, but a few years later, tragedy struck the family, something terrible and irreparable. His second wife was diagnosed with cancer a year after what doctors had assured was a successful operation. She passed away. Adelia was 16 when her mother passed away. Words can't describe how deeply she grieved, and it's even harder to imagine the pain of the widower. But Ramona and Manolo were almost pleased with the outcome. Of course, they didn't show it, but they had never liked Bea. In fact, they didn't really love anyone but themselves. At 16, Adelia decided that it was time to find a new home. Her mother was gone, and Ramona's words had stayed with her. You're nobody here, her stepsister had told her on their first day of meeting. How surprised Rado was when he found Adelia packing her things. Where are you going, dear? I love you like my own daughter. You are my daughter now, and I will never let you go, her stepfather said warmly, embracing her gently. Adelia burst into tears, but not out of sadness. These were tears of happiness. She had known it before, but now she was completely certain Rado, who had asked her to call him Dad, was a good man. He was as kind as her late mother, and most importantly, he was nothing like his own children. Adelia was overjoyed to realize this. Time passed, and Adelia and her stepfather managed to cope with such a terrible loss while Ramona and Manolo partied endlessly. Adelia studied diligently. She graduated from high school with excellent grades, completed her studies at the university, and continued her education in finance. After finishing her studies, she began working at her stepfather's company, helping and offering truly remarkable ideas. Rado was thrilled. Maybe he hadn't been able to raise his own children well, but his stepdaughter was a brilliant young woman. It wasn't surprising after all. Each of his children took after their mother. Some had a mother who was an angel, while others had the exact opposite. While Ramona was off to another party, Adelia was preparing a business plan. While Manolo was seeing off yet another girlfriend, Adelia was preparing dinner for her stepfather. Of course, there was always a cook in the house, but Adelia loved to make her only remaining parent happy, always finding time to cook his favorite dishes. In short, Rado's children, biological or not, were entirely different. He certainly loved Ramona and Manolo, but Adelia, she was something else. The financial empire grew, and Rado's family became even wealthier, though it seemed they couldn't get any richer. However, this brought him no joy. As it turned out, no amount of money could bring satisfaction when your heart starts to falter. It ached, it pulled, it made him stop in his tracks, rubbing his chest with his palm. At first, being used to his robust health, Rado didn't think it was serious, but after one particularly severe episode, he realized he couldn't put it off any longer. He tried to get treatment, but nothing really helped. With each passing day, the elderly businessman felt worse and worse. At first, he tried to fight his illness, but it was in vain. He eventually accepted that he was going to die soon. It couldn't be said that he was particularly worried about it. On the contrary, he knew that soon he would join his beloved on warm, fluffy clouds. In any case, he wasn't worried about himself, but what about his children, his own flesh and blood? What would happen to them? He didn't worry at all about Adelia. She was a smart girl, someone he could trust. But what about Ramona and Manolo? Would they be able to survive without him, without his money? Would they be able to manage the company properly after his death? And so their father decided to have a serious talk with them. Rado spotted his older children from a distance. They were both standing on their wide-open balcony. He watched them through the panoramic windows, unable to take his eyes off them. How beautiful they had grown. But beauty in this life doesn't mean much. That was something he knew for sure. He made his way to the balcony, intending to have a serious talk with them. He quietly opened the balcony door and froze in amazement. Neither Ramona nor Manolo noticed him, continuing their unpleasant conversation. "He's going to die soon," Ramona said curtly, not looking at her brother. She was almost hanging over the balcony, likely enjoying the view of the city waterfront. So what Manolo replied nonchalantly. Unlike his sister, he wasn't interested in the grand cityscape. He was focused on her, his younger sister, whom he thought to be so clever. He always obeyed her and could be considered her lackey. Did he like it? Very, very unlikely. But from early childhood, he was used to Ramona being the dominant one in their family. Who knows, maybe if he had tried to change, his fate wouldn't have been so dire. But at that time, no one knew how things would turn out. They couldn't know. Ramona shrugged disdainfully. "Manolo, you're so clueless. When our dad kicks the bucket, do you understand what will happen? The whole company will be ours. Do you realize how much money that is? It's not just the pennies he gives us. We'll be living like real royalty." Manolo shrugged. "And Adelia, she's our sister too, idiot." She elbowed him in the side, causing him to double over in surprise. "Who is she? She's nobody to us or to Dad. We'll get rid of her immediately if she gets in our way. We need to prepare for Dad's passing and come up with a plan to get everything right away." "Ramona," he said, "why bother? We'll get everything anyway. Just relax for once in your life. You don't understand. I have grand plans." "What kind of plans?" "You don't need to know that. Just know that everything is about to change. A new life awaits us." Rado clutched his heart. He exited the balcony as quietly as he had entered. From that moment, he fully realized that talking to his children was futile. He gave a sad smile, thinking, "I thought they lacked ambition, but Ramona has her own plans." With that thought, he dismissed any ideas of speaking with his children. It was pointless. Before he died, he had only one task left: to ensure Adelia's security. Fortunately, he was far from foolish. Rado passed away easily. He was gone in literally a second. His heart couldn't take it and just stopped. Who knows where he is now? Wherever it is, it's clearly a better place, a world where his children are currently barred from entering. Manolo and Ramona didn't find out immediately. They had flown off to the ocean together. They told their father they were going away to relax a bit. He smirked. What did they need to relax from? Everything was just like their mother, but their father never saw his children again. He died while Ramona and Manolo were sitting at a bar sipping cocktails. Even if they had found out immediately, they likely wouldn't have stopped their rivalry. They would have probably just ordered another round. Adelia was the first to find out. She returned from work later than usual and wanted to see her stepfather as soon as possible. She wanted to tell him about an idea she had during lunch. She came back to the apartment, burst into Rado's office, and fell to her knees before his lifeless body. That's how she learned he had died alone in his office one evening. Adelia didn't know what to do next. She only knew that nothing good would likely come of her life. Adelia immediately called her stepsister. She told her that their father was gone and that she had already begun arranging the funeral. She wanted his children to come back to town as soon as possible to ensure everything was done properly. But Ramona had her own plans for their father's death. "Dead, really?" Ramona asked with a smirk. Her voice was barely audible over the loud party music nearby. Wiping her tears, Adelia asked, Aren't you upset, guys? What's into you?" Ramona snapped. "And who gave you the right to handle his funeral arrangements? But you're not in town." Dad Rado, he's not your dad," Ramona said sharply. "Don't you dare call him that. Rado deserved a proper burial." Adelia retorted, hurt. "You can handle the funeral arrangements yourself. I was just trying to do what was best exactly, so just get lost already. Don't touch our father anymore." She paused for a few seconds as she was silent. The music died down. It seemed Ramona decided to move to a more private place. "Anyway, it's over. Dad is gone, and there's no point in us continuing to communicate. Manolo and I will return soon and take care of the funeral, and you'd better pack up and leave before we get back. Understood?" Understood. Naturally, Adelia was not surprised. She knew it would be just like this, and not just knew but was even prepared for it. In fact, she wasn't the only one who had prepared. Rado had known this would happen too. That's why he had bought Adelia a separate apartment years ago, just in case. But as long as her stepfather was alive, she wanted to spend as much time with him as possible. Well, now she had nothing left to do here anyway. "All right, let me know when you've organized everything," Adelia replied. "Will do," Ramona said sharply, and immediately ended the call. Adelia took her time packing up her things. Ramona's voice had sounded very aggressive, but Adelia knew they wouldn't be coming back anytime soon. Right now, her only concern was making sure the funeral went well. Gathering all her belongings, which weren't many, she went to the apartment her stepfather had once given her. Upon entering, she couldn't hold back her tears. Everything was so sterile, so empty. She missed Rado deeply. She quickly unpacked and began waiting for a call from Ramona. The most important thing now was to ensure her father had a dignified burial. But Ramona didn't call. She didn't call the next day or the day after. Adelia couldn't find any peace. Like in agony, she paced around the new apartment. A sense of impending disaster had settled in her mind. It had taken hold thoroughly, and it seemed for a long time. She had buried her mother once, but burying her stepfather was much harder. When her mother died, she had support. Now she had no one. Adelia wandered restlessly, unable to sleep at night. She kept thinking, and thinking again. What would happen next? How would the funeral go? What would happen to Rado's company? These questions were her primary concern. She had never relied on her stepfather's money, unlike his biological children, and she genuinely enjoyed working at the bank. Rado had done everything to spark her interest in this field. Adelia was passionate about it, just as the bank's head once was. She had come up with so many ideas over her years of work and had done so much for the business. And now what? Was she simply supposed to step aside? Or maybe Ramona would let her work at the company even after Rado's death? That question was on her mind. If you think about it, if Adelia had stayed, everyone would have benefited. Manolo and Ramona would always have money, and Adelia wouldn't have let the company go under. She would have managed it, maybe not as well as her stepfather, but she would have done a good job. And Ramona? Adelia didn't even consider Manolo. He was always his sister's pawn. What could they bring to the company? They didn't understand anything about it. In short, Adelia was concerned about her stepfather's life's work. She didn't want his ignorant children to take over and mishandle it. So far, they had done nothing good in their entire lives. Adelia jumped in surprise as her mobile phone rang. She immediately rushed to answer it, convinced it was Ramona calling. She must have arranged the funeral already, Adelia thought. But she was greatly disappointed when it turned out to be just one of the company's leading managers. Reluctantly, she answered the call. "Adelia, where are you?" asked Isidoro Gutierrez, a bank employee. He and Adelia were roughly the same age and had similar temperaments. The young man was as passionate about his work as she was. Rado had held him in high regard. At one point, Adelia's stepfather even mentioned that Isidoro reminded him of himself when he was younger. Adelia and Isidoro had a good, trusting relationship, so she was not too surprised by his question. She replied, "At home, well, in my apartment. I don't really feel at home here yet, and I'm not sure what to do next. Ramona hasn't called. I don't even know if I can continue working. It seems like they're not expecting me there anymore." Ramona, his daughter from his first marriage, right? What does she have to do with it? I've been working for your stepfather for 8 years and I've only seen her a couple of times. She's an heir, just like her brother Manolo, but aren't you an heir? Adelia, he paused slightly. Anyway, that's not important. Where are you? I already answered, she said irritably. At home. The funeral is about to start, and you're at home. She almost dropped the phone in shock. The funeral. Up. Isidoro was silent for a couple of seconds. They didn't even tell you, did they? All of us have arrived, and all the relatives too, except his damn biological daughter. How can you not come to the funeral? Adelia was at a loss. All this time she had been waiting for Ramona to call and tell her where and when the funeral would be. Of course, Ramona wasn't a kind-hearted person, but Adelia thought even she wouldn't be so inconsiderate as to not invite Adelia to the funeral. How could that happen? She decided to clarify. Sorry, are you sure? Well, my stepsister was supposed to call me, but she hasn't yet. Adelia, do I look like an idiot to you? He asked, offended. Of course I'm sure. Maybe she forgot to inform you. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I'll send you the address now. Get dressed quickly and come over. Adelia hung up the phone and then picked it up again, wanting to throw the device against the wall with all her might. Ramona couldn't do this. She simply had no right to act this way. She had already kicked Adelia out of what she considered her home. Throughout her childhood, those little devils had never let her forget that she was nobody in that house, that she was an outsider. Wasn't that enough? Did they really need to humiliate her further? Was it absolutely necessary for Ramona to crush Adelia, who had already lost everyone she was close to? Adelia, biting her lip, started putting on the mourning dress she had prepared in advance. Even if Manolo and Ramona hated her, though there was no reason for it, even if they spoke ill of her, spread rumors, and deprived her of all the joys of life, Adelia would attend her stepfather's funeral. There was no other way. She wanted to say a proper goodbye to the person who had given her everything she had now. Adelia arrived at the cemetery, managing to get there just in time for the service. She quietly entered the church and stood off to the side. She immediately spotted her step-relatives. Ramona was sobbing so forcefully and theatrically. If you didn't know her personally, you might believe her suffering, but knowing this hypocrite up close, it was clear that it was all just a show. Manolo stood nearby, his gaze detached and lost. Unlike his sister, he lacked the talent for theatrics. He didn't even pretend that his father's death upset him. It was evident that he simply didn't care. The farewell with the deceased began. People continued to approach Rado. Some of them Adelia knew, while others were unfamiliar. Ramona approached the casket, kissed the deceased, but couldn't hide her disgust. Workers and distant relatives came forward, all of them saying goodbye to this, without exaggeration, remarkable person. Adelia was deeply moved. It seemed that only now did she fully understand that the stepfather she had considered her real father for many years was dead. Tears flowed from her eyes, her hand trembled, and his voice echoed in her mind. Memories started to flicker before her eyes. There he was, teaching her to cook when Adelia was 13. There he was, tenderly hugging her after her mother's funeral. Adelia felt a pain she had never felt before, bitterly weeping. She took an uncertain step toward the casket. She took a second, a third step, and she almost reached it, seeing his face so changed after death from afar, when suddenly someone roughly yanked her arm. "Where do you think you're going?" Ramona hissed from behind. Adelia couldn't see her stepsister's face through the veil of tears, but she was sure that Ramona was sneering maliciously. Adelia pulled her arm back as if it were on fire. "Let me go. I want to say goodbye to Dad." "He's not your father," Ramona snapped. She raised her voice and looked around contemptuously at everyone present. "Did anyone even invite you here?" Ramona asked with a sharp tone. The people who had come to the funeral began to whisper among themselves, and all eyes were on the two stepsisters. From the crowd, someone muttered in confusion, "Who is that other girl?" Adelia pulled her arm away, addressing not only Ramona but also those who seemed to doubt her. "I'm his stepdaughter," she said, sniffling. "Rado was like a real father to me. I loved him like a real father, and he loved me like a real daughter." Ramona sneered. "Are you trying to say that she emphasized the last word, father loved you more than he loved Manolo and me? Who do you think you are?" Adelia lowered her head. "I didn't say that." A more insistent voice rose from the crowd. "Who is she? Rado only had 2 children, didn't he?" Ramona smiled triumphantly but quickly composed herself, resuming her mask of a grieving daughter. At that moment, as always, Manolo came to his sister's aid. He approached and gently took Ramona by the arm, as if bringing her back to reality. His look conveyed everything without words. His gaze said, "You're overstepping. Remember that you're in mourning." Ramona shook her head but still wouldn't let Adelia near the casket. "You weren't invited to the funeral," she said, turning away and addressing the visitors. "This is the daughter of his second wife. I think you understand that she's just playing a part. This girl is pretending to be upset over our father's death. She always wanted just one thing, his death. She wanted to get all his money. She needs to leave." Adelia couldn't hold back any longer. Her voice broke into a shout, her tear-streaked eyes no longer able to see clearly. "Shut up. You drove him to this. You're to blame for everything," she screamed in hysteria. But Ramona was impossible to defeat in this battle. She theatrically retreated into her brother's embrace. Manolo continued the performance. "We know everything. Adelia, don't you dare put on a show here. You stressed him out. You drove him to his death. You wanted him to die quickly to get our inheritance. Get out. You have no right to approach him. You shouldn't even be here." Crying from pain and humiliation, Adelia fell to her knees. She knew Ramona and Manolo weren't the best people, but this was beyond what she had imagined. All she could do was quietly say, "It's all untrue," but neither Manolo nor Ramona nor any of the other people at the funeral cared about her words. After finishing her dramatic sobbing, Ramona repeated, "Leave before we call security." Adelia couldn't summon the strength to stand. At that moment, Isidoro approached her, taking her by the shoulders and quietly said, "Adelia, it's best if we leave now." And so, the two most important people in Rado's life, the beloved stepdaughter and his best employee, left the funeral together. They didn't know what the others would think of them, but they knew one thing for sure: Ramona and Manolo were dangerous people, and it was better not to confront them. Adelia barely recovered from what had happened at the funeral. In truth, Ramona's words didn't affect her much. She had long been accustomed to the fact that Rado's children were not the most pleasant people, but the fact that she had never been able to say goodbye to her father completely broke her. Adelia lay on the bed, choking on her own tears. Work was no longer on her mind, especially after the things Ramona had said at the funeral. Most of the people who held significant positions in the company had witnessed the dreadful altercation. Adelia knew which side they would take. She had no doubts. Of course, she was nobody. She had no real connection to Rado, but his own children had far more rights. Adelia stopped leaving the house and stopped answering calls. She didn't even respond to Isidoro anymore. He kept insisting that she had too low an opinion of the staff, saying everyone understood perfectly well, but she wasn't interested. Not only had she lost her father, but she had also lost her support. After all the upheaval, she didn't want to live, but she knew that the late Rado would likely not have wished such a fate for her. The first time Adelia left the house was when the notary called. As much as she wanted to avoid going, and as much as her step-relatives wanted her there, she had to attend. She was obliged to go for the following reason. Adelia was as much a rightful heir as Rado's own children. Her name was in the will. Summoning her strength, she went to the notary's office. She had always known Rado was very smart, but she hadn't suspected that he seemed to know everything in advance. He knew and had prepared well. Upon arriving, Adelia quietly walked into the spacious lobby. She took the last available table. Even though the reception area was almost empty, she simply didn't want to draw unnecessary attention to herself. Yet, she still did. Ramona glared at her from beneath her brows. That's how she regarded Adelia as a rival and looked at her with malice. Adelia mostly ignored it. She didn't even understand why she was there. She had already received her inheritance years ago. Why had Rado included her name in the will? She averted her gaze, feeling indifferent. Money was the last thing on her mind. She had always been indifferent to wealth, just like her mother. "It's time to read Rado's will," the notary began, clearing his throat. He added, "Although we all understand why we're here to find out who will inherit his empire." A shiver ran down Adelia's spine. The notary seemed to be just like them. Ramona and Manolo had unpleasant, malicious smirks frozen on their faces. Adelia couldn't understand how anyone could be so cruel towards their own father. She wanted to get up and smack those two insolent faces, but Adelia knew how to keep her composure. She wanted to leave that place as soon as possible, go home and burrow back into her warm bed for a week. She didn't respond, but her stepsister couldn't restrain herself. "Can we hurry up?" she squirmed, as if itching was tormenting her. "Let's skip all the letters and farewell speeches." "All right," the notary shrugged. "What do you want from me?" "What do you want, Ramona?" "Just say that I got the damned company, and then Manolo and I will leave this place," Ramona snapped. Manolo gave his sister a puzzled look. He often looked at her like that, but today something seemed to have changed. It looked as though he was beginning to understand something. "You?" he asked nervously. "Who else?" Ramona shot back like an annoying mosquito. "You and us," she said. Manolo exclaimed in astonishment. "Actually, there are two of us." "Oh, sure." Ignoring her brother, she turned to the notary. "Just read out who gets what." "And yes, is she?" Ramona pointed at Adelia. "Really needed here?" The notary smiled coldly. "Actually, you could say that she's the only one who's needed here." For a couple of seconds, he rummaged through the papers, then pulled out a document. "Adelia, the testator, that is Rado, bequeathed his company to you. You are now its rightful and sole owner. Congratulations." He glanced at Ramona with disdain. "And you, Ramona, and your brother Manolo will receive a lifetime annuity from the company's income, amounting to, let's see, where is it? 10% of the net annual profit each. Well, not too shabby." Adelia's mouth dropped open in astonishment, while Ramona jumped up abruptly as if she had been jabbed. In one wide stride, she was next to the notary, and snatched the paper from his hands with a sharp, mechanical movement. After reading the document, she tore it into 2 pieces and howled like a she-wolf. "No, no, I know this nonsense." Manolo leaped up after his sister crouched down and tried to piece together the torn fragments. Ramona turned crimson, her hands clenched into fists. Manolo seemed to be in disbelief too. Adelia remained seated, motionless. Not that she was opposed, she just hadn't expected this at all. Though, thinking about it, such an outcome was quite predictable. She reminded herself once again how smart her late stepfather had been. The notary looked at Ramona with undisguised contempt. "Do you really think that tearing up your copy of the will means it's null and void?" He turned his gaze to Adelia and softened. "Congratulations again. I think it's best for you to leave now. We'll see each other later. I'll give you a call." Adelia did just that. She quickly stood up, nodded gratefully to the notary, and hurriedly left. Seeing Ramona so enraged was a bit frightening, so calculating. What might have been her share? She quickly made her exit. Adelia understood that she wouldn't be left in peace, but what could she do? Let these grown-up, immature kids mess things up? No, she couldn't let Rado's affairs be mishandled as dictated by her stepfather's will. Adelia became the new head of the company. Fortunately, she had worked there for several years, so the job came easily to her. For a while, she was apprehensive about going to the office. After all, the staff had witnessed that unpleasant scene at the funeral. But when she finally mustered the courage to go in, she was pleasantly surprised. It turned out that she had thought too poorly of the people there, and they were far from being fools. As Isidoro had said, everyone understood perfectly and saw everything clearly. They knew what Ramona and Manolo were like, and they knew what Adelia was like as well: smart, calm, calculating, and in a good way, ambitious. Most importantly, she always thought about the company and the people who worked there, not just about filling her own pockets. Her colleagues expressed their condolences for what she had gone through at the funeral. They, like Adelia herself, deeply missed their kind boss. Adelia was glad to return to her beloved work to distract herself from the grief. She threw herself into her tasks. Everything was going well until one day something happened that turned everything upside down. That day, Adelia stayed late at the office as usual. Most of the staff had already left, leaving only the security guards and cleaners. She was sitting in the soft light of her desk lamp, bent over a stack of papers, when someone knocked on the door. "Yes, yes," she called out without looking up from her work. Adelia only looked up when she heard a familiar voice. She looked up and almost burst out laughing. Standing before her was Manolo. He looked to her like a character from a cheap romance novel. He was dressed in a formal suit heavily scented with some pungent cologne. His dark, thick hair was so heavily lacquered that it seemed you could see your reflection in it if you tried hard enough. He was holding a large bouquet of red roses. Once her laughter subsided, Adelia asked, "Lost your former glory among your girlfriends? Now you have to resort to extreme measures." Manolo didn't share her amusement. "Adelia, I came here to see you," he said grandly. She rolled her eyes. "Is this something urgent? I still have a ton of work to do." He quickly moved closer and sat down across from her. "Adelia, you have always evoked only warm feelings in me, and I want to say that I have loved you from the very first moment we met. But Ramona, she always pressured me, and only recently have I managed to finally rid myself of her influence. Adelia, will you marry me?" He looked at her as if she were his last hope. Adelia laughed even harder, her eyes darkening with astonishment. "Are you drunk or something?" she asked, wiping away the tears that had formed from laughing. "And isn't it a bit odd that you're my stepbrother?" He jerked his chin in offense, pulled out his phone, and began reading something on it. Adelia couldn't help herself, leaning slightly to peek at his smartphone. She saw what she had expected. Manolo had an open chat with Ramona. It was clear she had persuaded him to propose to Adelia to take over the company. Adelia chuckled once more, returning to her seat, and asked, "Ramona sent you, didn't she?" "Do you seriously think I would fall for this, Adelia?" he began, continuing to read the instructions his scheming sister had sent him. "I've always had warm feelings for you." "Believe me, really," she replied now with a calmer tone. "Yes, that's why I've always treated you well, the way I did. So come on, marry me. I love you." Adelia rolled her eyes. At first it seemed very amusing, but now it was slightly irritating. She picked up a stack of papers, slammed them on the table to keep them from scattering, and stood up. "Fine, I'll finish this tomorrow," she said to herself, heading toward the office door. "And what you've come up with, or rather, what Ramona has come up with, I've never seen anything dumber in my life. Ramona really thinks that if I marry you, she'll be able to get the company. I thought she was much smarter than that. Wait, Adelia, I love you," he insisted, sounding like a broken record. "How could you be so?" She left a prepared insult on the tip of her tongue. "How can you not see that Ramona is just using you? You should have been living your own life by now, and yet you're still running after your sister. Do you really live so poorly? Aren't you satisfied with the money you have? You don't even work. Why do you need this company? Don't you understand that you'll just ruin it? You'll ruin your father's life legacy, ruin the careers of thousands of people who will lose their jobs, and most importantly, you'll still end up without money because the company will be gone. Think carefully about what I've said." Having said that, she left her office, leaving Manolo completely alone. The next day began with news that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Sitting in a holding cell, Adelia couldn't believe that all this was happening to her. In her life, she kept pinching herself, slapping herself, and shaking her head, trying to wake up from this horrifying, almost inconceivable nightmare. But it wasn't a dream. It was all real. The morning after the aforementioned drama, after Adelia had left Manolo in her office, his body was found there. From the early morning, law enforcement came to visit Adelia. She was the last person to see Manolo alive. After asking a few questions about the previous day, they arrested her without hesitation. Of course, it was Ramona's doing. She told the police that her brother had gone to propose to Adelia. Apparently, he had allowed himself a bit too much, and this snake of a woman had killed him. Adelia confirmed this version, but only partially. She explained that Manolo had indeed come to see her and had proposed marriage, but she had firmly rejected him. She detailed the schemes Ramona had orchestrated, explaining that Manolo could never have truly loved her. He simply wasn't capable of love. She shared her version of the events, insisting that she had left the office first. When she left, he was alive and well. She urged them to question the security guards and cleaners and to check the security cameras, but strangely enough, the footage had somehow disappeared. The security guards and cleaners only saw Adelia leaving. No one had seen Manolo that evening. With no evidence of her innocence, she was charged with murder. Her last hope was her lawyer. Who knew? Maybe he could unravel this tangled case. At least she was counting on that. The young but already very successful lawyer arrived at the detention center. He had already had a chance to speak with his client. Adelia seemed to him very sweet, so sweet that his trained eye immediately recognized she was not a murderer. Therefore, he was determined to find out who was behind this. After studying the case of this peculiar family, he had little doubt about his suspicion Ramona. It seemed this girl was not as simple as she wanted to appear. He was almost certain that Ramona was the one who framed his client, but he had no evidence yet, not yet. Federico Gallis, that was the lawyer's name, arrived at the bank's office. He didn't rush to go inside, knowing that the devil is in the details. He started to walk around the tall building, examining it closely. To everyone else, he looked like just another bystander, but he knew for sure that he would soon find something. He walked around, stood by the entrance, eavesdropping on the conversations of employees who were taking short breaks. It seemed he had found the first clue. He overheard that one of the building's cleaners had died on the same evening as Manolo. The workers who were spreading this gossip were horrified. It was a curse on the company, they said. 2 deaths in one night, could that happen? The office workers couldn't understand, but Federico knew for certain this was all part of someone's plan. He decided to look into the cleaner's death later. He needed to find more evidence. Think, he told himself as he walked past the local trash bins until an interesting detail caught his eye. Next to the garbage cans was a huge, even gigantic pile of clean, white paper, unopened packs, lots of unused, unpackaged, high-quality paper. Federico knew from experience that in office work, paper is never in surplus. So what had happened? Who had thrown away such a treasure? He realized this was another clue and decided to follow this lead. He entered the office and started having conversations, casual chats, as his interlocutors thought, but very important for Federico. One of the employees complained that they had just ordered paper. The box was in the basement, but it was empty. And where had all the contents gone? The employee didn't know, but Federico immediately understood. It remained to determine how the cleaner had died, and it seemed he had already discovered most of the details. The day of the trial arrived. The trial of Adelia. The unfortunate woman sat on the defendant's bench, wringing her hands, while the main villain of the family smiled cunningly. Despite all her acting talent, Ramona couldn't maintain her composure. Soon she thought the company would be in her pocket, or at least she thought so. She thought so until the young lawyer, the main character of this trial, opened his mouth. Federico stood up, ready to present his evidence. Fortunately, he was well prepared. He surveyed Ramona with a keen eye, thinking she doesn't even realize what's coming. How naive. Introducing himself to the court, he began his speech. Isn't it strange that the security camera footage was deleted and nobody knows who could have done it? Except for the security guard who was responsible for it. He cast a glance at Ramona. Odd, isn't it? The judge's expression remained unchanged. What are you driving at? Explain your position, the judge said. Federico continued. It's also strange that the office just ordered clean paper, several hundred reams. The box was delivered to the storage room, but the paper was thrown away. Why order paper and then immediately throw it out? This suggests that something, or rather someone, was carried into the office instead of the paper. Ramona jumped from her seat, shouting, "I object," but the judge quickly silenced her. It seemed that everyone accusing Adelia was suddenly starting to see the light. Pleased with the effect he had achieved, Federico continued. And it's also peculiar that an elderly cleaner died on the same evening. The killer apparently didn't expect that the poor old woman would be autopsied, but I arranged that. Amanda Yees, the cleaner from the company's central office who died that same day, was injected with a drug that caused an instant heart stoppage. But the strange thing is, forensic experts determined that her death occurred at around 7 in the evening. However, she was seen leaving the building at a much later time at 11:00, to be precise. This testimony was provided by all the security guards. Therefore, we can assume that the person in question was not the cleaner, but someone who had disguised themselves as Amanda. The judge leaned forward. "And what is your version?" Ramona Borio, the daughter of the late Rado Borio, couldn't accept that her father left the company to his stepdaughter, so she persuaded her brother to help her. She lied to him, claiming that Adelia had forbidden both of them from coming to the office. She fabricated this little lie to convince him that they needed to sneak into the building unnoticed. To that end, she killed the cleaner by injecting her with a heart-stopping drug, then stole her belongings and dressed in them, pretending to be the cleaner, Amanda. Additionally, she intercepted the paper delivery from the courier, posing as an office employee. Then she used a forklift to dump all the reams of new paper at a distant landfill and placed her brother in the box that originally contained the paper, instructing him in advance to propose to Adelia, supposedly to gain control of the father's company. But Ramona had her own plans. No one suspected that both of them had entered the office. She was dressed as a cleaner and was pushing a plywood container on a cart, supposedly to throw it away. But inside was Manolo. Ramona had sent her brother to Adelia's office, and when Adelia left, she ruthlessly killed her own brother by hitting him on the head with a heavy paperweight. Then she exited through the back door, having obtained keys from the same cleaner, after deleting all the video footage while the guard was out for a smoke. She dressed the poor Amanda's corpse in her usual clothes taken from her locker. That's why the guards thought the elderly woman must have had a heart attack in the room where she was changing after her shift. Ramona had deceived her brother. She had premeditated this cruel murder. In this way, she would have rid herself of both her biological brother and her stepsister. Adelia would be imprisoned for a long time, and Ramona would personally kill Manolo. She hoped to claim the company for herself alone. Immediately after his speech, Federico presented all the necessary evidence to the court. Justice prevailed. Ramona was charged with the murders of both the elderly cleaner and her own brother. To Adelia's great relief, all charges against her were dropped. She was free once again. Stepping out of the detention center where she had been held after the trial and retrieving her personal belongings, Adelia took a deep breath. "Freedom," she murmured, wiping away tears of joy, not noticing Federico approaching her. "It feels good, doesn't it? Just stepping out and breathing fresh air." "I think you're happy to be free now," Adelia smiled happily. "You can't even imagine how much. And it's not just about the charges being dropped," she admitted. "Now I am truly free. Ramona, she never gave me peace. She's been tormenting me since I was 12. And Manolo, I'm sorry he's gone, but damn it, finally each of them got what they deserved." Only then did she take a closer look at her lawyer, the man who had saved her, who had done his job professionally. She smiled at him and thanked him sincerely. Federico seemed even happier than Adelia. The case, this girl, had touched him deeply. "Adelia, would you like to go on a date with me?" he asked. Adelia laughed cheerfully. "I'd love to." Federico laughed along with her, and they both went on their way, away from that dreadful place, from the intrigues and cruelty that had pursued poor Adelia all her life. At that moment, she was simply rejoicing in life and had no idea that she was walking beside her future husband, that in a year she would give birth to a beautiful son whom she would, of course, name after her beloved adopted father.